Imagine you had to predict the next move of a complete stranger. Not their past, not their character, but the exact action they will take next. This is exactly what game theory tries to do. For decades, it has been one of the most vital tools in economics. Corporations use it, governments use it, military strategists use it. Even Nobel Prizes have been awarded for its models. The idea sounds astonishingly simple. If humans act rationally, then their behavior should be describable through mathematics. A problem begins. A problem that is surprisingly rarely discussed. Because before we can calculate how humans act, we first have to answer what human action even is. To understand this critique, we must first realize that game theory and praxeology don't even answer the same question. Game theory asks, which strategy is the best under specific conditions? Praxeology asks, what does actually mean to act? This might sound like a minor distinction at first. In reality, however, they represent two completely different scientific methodologies. Every game theoretic model begins with a set of assumptions. Who are the players? What choices are available to them? What outcomes can occur? What value or utility do these outcomes have for each individual player? Only when all these building blocks are locked in place does the actual mathematics begin. In other words, game theory analyzes choices within a predefined game. The game might be highly complex. There could be thousands of strategies. But the playing field already exists. Praxeology begins in a completely different way. It doesn't start by asking about players, not about strategies, not about equilibria. It begins with a single foundational axiom. Human action is purposeful behavior. At first, it needs nothing more than that. No utility functions, no mathematical models, no assumptions of perfectly rational actors. Just the undeniable fact that humans consciously employ means to achieve what they subjectively view as a better state of affairs. This is exactly where their paths diverge. Game theory must first assume how humans make choices. Praxeology does not. It doesn't claim that humans are objectively rational. It doesn't claim that people always make smart choices. It doesn't even claim that they succeed. It merely states, whenever a human acts, they choose the alternative that, at that exact moment, they subjectively prefer over all others. Whether they regret the choices later, whether it was based on flawed information, or whether it looks completely irrational to an outsider, is entirely irrelevant. Because praxeology does not explain the content of a goal. It explains the logic structure of human action itself. Yet, these differing starting points have profound consequences. Because if a theory relies on assumptions about how humans choose, what happens if those assumptions are completely wrong? That is precisely where the real critique of game theory begins. One of the most critical pillars of game theory is the assumption of rationality. Put simply, every player pursues their own goals and chooses the strategy that maximizes their utility. Without this assumption, the mathematics behind most game theoretic models would collapse. But right here, praxeology poses a crucial question. What does rational actually mean? Does it mean making as much money as possible, minimizing risk, always choosing the biggest material advantage? Who gets to decide that? For praxeology, there is no objective ranking of human goals. People do not act because a mathematician calculated their preferences. They act based on their subjective value judgments. This means every individual evaluates the exact same situation differently. What is a massive gain for one person might be completely worthless to another. And that is precisely we cannot simply take preferences for granted. We only discover them after people act. Let's take the most famous example in game theory, The prisoner's dilemma. The classical analysis states, for each individual prisoner, the rational choice is to confess, so both confess. This outcome is called a Nash equilibrium. But look closer. This outcome doesn't follow from the mathematics alone. It follows entirely from the assumptions that were hard-coded into the setup. The mathematics only work if we already know what goals the two prisoners are pursuing. But how do we know that? Perhaps one cares most about his freedom. Perhaps the other values loyalty above all else. Perhaps one believes the police are lying. Perhaps one would rather face a longer prison sentence than betray his friend. Game theory can model all of these scenarios, but it has to predetermine those preferences. The mathematics don't discover these preferences, they presuppose them. This is the core methodological divide. Game theory answers the question, what would be the best decision if we already know what everyone wants? Praxeology asks a much deeper question. How do we even know what people want in the first place? Its answer is surprisingly simple. We don't. We cannot derive their goals from formulas. We cannot measure them. We cannot observe them before an action takes place. We only recognize them through the act of choosing itself. Yet, even if we did know a person's goals, an even bigger problem remains. Game theory doesn't just presuppose preferences, it presupposes the game itself. But who actually creates new games? That is exactly what we will explore in the next chapter. Up until now, we've talked about the players, but there is a far more fundamental assumption in game theory. It always starts with an already existing game. That sounds obvious. After all, you need rules before you can compare strategies. But this obviousness does not exist in the real economy. Markets are not chessboards. Nobody defines their rules completely. Nobody knows all possible strategies, and nobody knows what opportunities will exist tomorrow. Imagine two supermarkets. Game theory examines how they react to one another. If one cuts prices, the other might follow suit. If one increases quality, the competitor reacts as well. This is a classic strategic game. But what happens if suddenly supermarkets aren't even needed anymore? If someone starts delivering groceries directly to your doorstep, or if a completely unprecedented business model emerges? When that happens, it's not the strategy that changes, the game itself changes. This is where one of the most vital insights of Austrian school comes into play. For Ludwig von Mises and later Israel Kürzner, entrepreneurship isn't just about making better calculations. Entrepreneurs discover opportunities that others don't even see yet. They don't just react to the market, they alter it. This discovery isn't the result of a math problem, nor is it a strategy within a known game. It creates entirely new possibilities that nobody had in their models before. And this is exactly where game theory hits its limits, because any mathematical analysis requires a defined solution space. It needs to know which players are participating, which strategies are possible, which outcomes can occur. But entrepreneurship alters these exact variables. New products are born, new technologies emerge, new markets are forged. The playing field is constantly expanding, and something that doesn't even exist today can completely reshape the economy tomorrow. How do you mathematically model a possibility that no one even knows exists yet? When Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, Apple didn't just win an existing game, it changed the rules of an entire industry. And this perfectly highlights the single greatest difference between game theory and praxeology. Let's look at a concrete example. In 2006, phone manufacturers were competing over the exact same things. Better batteries, smaller devices, better keyboards, lower prices. Within that game, game theory could absolutely help. How does Nokia react to Motorola? How does Samsung react to Nokia? Which strategy maximizes profit? But then, something entirely different happened. Apple didn't design a better keyboard, Apple made the keyboard obsolete. The company didn't win by playing by the existing rules. It rewrote the rules entirely. Suddenly, a smartphone wasn't just competing with other phones, it was competing with cameras, MP3 players, GPS devices, computers. The playing field was completely redefined. This is entrepreneurship in the Austrian sense. Not the perfect reaction to known options, but the discover of entirely new horizons. Beneath this lies an even deeper problem. Game theory frequently treats knowledge as if it were already out there, perhaps unequally distributed, perhaps incomplete, but fundamentally known. Praxeology views knowledge completely differently. Knowledge is discovered. Entrepreneurs see opportunities that no one saw yesterday. Consumers discover new desires. Technologies open up avenues no one had ever dreamed of. Markets, therefore, are not an equilibrium. They are an ongoing process of discovery. None of this means game theory is wrong. On the contrary, when the rules are set, when the options are known, and when we are truly looking at the clearly defined game, it is a stunningly powerful mathematical tool. But the economy is not a static game. Its rules change. New players enter, new goals form, new opportunities are discovered. And that is why it is never enough to simply analyze strategies within a given framework. Game theory asks an important question. What is the best strategy within a known game? Praxeology asks a more foundational one. How do these games even come into existence? It doesn't start with equilibria, not with formulas, and not with the assumption of perfectly rational human beings. It begins with a single simple truth: human act. And that is precisely why the world is constantly changing. Not because humans calculate flawless strategies, but because they learn, they err, they discover, and time again, they create games that yesterday nobody even knew were possible. Perhaps that is the exact reason why human action can never be fully squeezed into a mathematical formula.